Hey guys, welcome to Create a Place podcast. Today I'm here with Kelly Colón. She is founder of Eladex Coaching and Consulting. She coaches on executive functions. She's a professor and she's a fierce advocate for the neurodivergent community. We're going to have some really great conversations today about how to design for real life. So I hope you enjoy it, and I have lots of things to take away.
Kelly, it's so good to see you. I am glad that we were able to connect here. And here we are. We're in AIS's headquarters in Boston in their showroom. We kind of wanted to do something a little fun here. We're going to talk about neurodiversity, and this is going to test all kinds of neurodiversity challenges that we're both having right now. So we have our fidget, and we're going to see how this goes. But I'm so glad that we're talking about this. During Mental Health Awareness Month, because I think it's super critical. And you have done a lot of work in neurodivergence studies. Neurodivergent, help me out with these words. Let's start with that.
Okay, so I think that a lot of people think that they're interchangeable, but they're not. So we talk about neurodiversity, which is essentially just the full spectrum of like every brain.
Okay.
So it's people who are what we would say neurotypical, which is really a social construct. It just simply means that their brains are wired or operating the way society feels is normal.
Gotcha.
It's a social construct. All the way to neurodivergent, which is a brain that obviously differs or diverges from the societal norm. So you hear a lot of terminology, neurodivergent and neurotypical, and people think that that is just like an absolute. They don't recognize
one or the other.
Yeah, they don't recognize that. You kind of, it's a spectrum, and those two terms are actually social constructs. They're not actual medical terms.
Gotcha.
Which I think people, kind of don't realize. And then neurodiversity is really kind of the umbrella term that covers that full spectrum.
Okay.
So if you were to say, like, for me, I'm neurodivergent, right? Because I diverge from societally expected, function, cognitive function. So I don't know if that's helpful.
That is very helpful. And I'm sure I am on the spectrum somewhere in there. And I probably should check that out. I think everybody is at some level, and we'll get a little bit more into that. But you are on the spectrum, and one of those spectrums that you talked about.
Yep.
Tell me about how that was growing up, because obviously we've grown up in a generation where that was not anything that we talked about.
No.
If there was any sort of divergence from the norm, it was looked down on. It was get yourself together, pull it out, like make it happen. It was just kind of, or you just couldn't do what you needed to do and you kind of got left behind. So how did that feel, and what did that look like in your own family?
So, I mean, my family, I grew up in a very traditional Irish Catholic family. My mother was one of 11. I have 42 first cousins. Children, we grew up at a time where children were seen, not heard. Children were had meals in a different room.
The little table around the corner.
Yeah, right? And you graduated to the to the adult table or the teenage table. So that was sort of contextually, it's sort of the world that I grew up in. It was a single parent home. So my mother was diagnosed later. I was much older, but she was diagnosed with bipolar. As we've learned a little bit more about kind of diving back into her history, we suspect there were other diagnoses involved. But she had mental health challenges. And so she really struggled to raise I'm the oldest of 4 girls.
Yeah.
And probably the most what we would say is quintessential ADHD personality, interrupting, talking too much, fidgeting all the time, constantly emotion. A lot of the things that you see attributed to boys who are ADHD, I exhibited a lot of that as a kid. And so, growing up in an environment, in a direct family and an expanded family where children were not supposed to be seen and not heard, you can imagine, how hard that was for me. And growing up, I sort of was coined the term in our family as the black sheep, because I didn't have a problem saying no. I didn't have a problem challenging authority. And so I became kind of this, iconic troublemaker. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Constantly complaining, always challenging the status quo. You don't ever talk back to your grandfather. And I was like, why? He's an old guy. It was just,
he's just a person.
Yeah. And so I just, it was really hard. And when I spent majority of my childhood being told sit down, shut up, you're too stupid, why won't you stop doing this, why can't you do that, why can't you do this like your cousin can do, and what is wrong with you, or so there's just this constant barrage. And then, as my other siblings came along who exhibited very similar attributes, all three of my other siblings are neurodivergent as well. And so, you kind of you hear it yourself, and then you see it repeated with your siblings. And so it was very hard. I was told that by teachers, you're too stupid. Why? I mean, I can remember kindergarten, 5 years old, my kindergarten teacher, and I sat next to this girl, Stacy, who I still know to this day. And Stacy could color in the lines, right? And she could do shading, and she could color in the lines. Mine, I was holding the crayon like this, and I was coloring all over the place. And I will never forget the teacher coming over, giving me another paper, and said, "Why don't you try again and do a better job like Stacy?"
Oh,
I was 5, and so like this was just sort of
crush my spirit in kindergarten.
This was what you learned. Like this is the experience that I had. You're too stupid to go to college. Um, you know, couldn't really have any friends because after a while your friends were like, "What is wrong with you? You won't ever stop talking." So
Well,
it
the
was hard.
educational system is not set
Oh,
up for
so
that either. I
different.
mean, it's still to
No.
this day, struggles, with a
Mhm.
lot of that. But, especially then, it was if you weren't,
Yeah.
conforming, if you weren't, and already at that age, right? We were starting with the testing and,
Yeah.
living up to the standards. And, there's not, I think more, there's kind of, let's see what you are really good at. I mean, at
Yep.
that age, let's divert to something else or let's, try some of your other skills. I wonder, as you were growing up and you were struggling with all those, were you also identifying some things you're like, damn, I'm really good at this?
So
Maybe some people, other
I
people are not.
did. I did. It's you spend so much time hearing how awful you are
Yeah.
that you don't. I mean, I distinctly remember as a young kid and in even a teenager, even into my young adult, even as a young mom,
Yeah.
just reinforcing this narrative that there's something wrong with me, that I'm showing up in this world as a less version because no one seems to understand me. And it was weird because I could go into rooms, I could go into spaces. My early career, I was a real estate broker, and I would meet with buyers and sellers, and I would immediately connect with them. And you know, because I could read people really well.
Mhm.
And it was like, you don't read people, you don't hear stories in your brain when you lay down at night. Like, what is wrong with you? And so there were certain things as I got older I figured out that I was really good at. But up to that point, I mean, going back, my mother was hospitalized from the time I was 8 until about 4 or 5 years before she passed away. So bipolar is very much up and down. And she would just, because no one understood what was going on, at 9 years old, you'd go live with an aunt and uncle for 9 months because your mother was in an institution that didn't allow for people to visit, right? Because they didn't know what mental health was back
Yeah.
then.
Right.
And so, you didn't talk about it. I didn't want to say to people, well, there's something wrong. I'm like hearing things. I can hear lights, like, I can hear buzzings of lights, and you're like, oh my God, I might be crazy. They might send me away
Yeah.
to a hospital. So this is sort of the world that we grew up in.
Right.
It is radically different now, and it started to shift when my oldest was born. So she was born in '97. So kind of the late '90s, early 2000s, we started to see things open up a little bit more, not be so stigmatized, at least medically.
Yeah.
Societally, it still was, but medically, it wasn't.
So you saw things changing in the
Yeah.
medical world,
Yes,
and
but
then
not
you were able to
societally.
start, then doing testing and working through that with your own kids, right?
Yeah. Yeah. My oldest was 10 weeks, almost 11 weeks early. So preemie, early intervention, which led into, IEPs and, special education. So, from the earliest time, that was sort of part of our life.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
That's a real struggle. And you're trying to show up for them while
Mhm.
you're probably just now figuring out what's going on with you too,
Yeah.
right? Was that all happening at the same time?
All at the same time. Like, oh, put your boots on with these socks. Meanwhile, I just want to rip my shoes off because I can't stand the line on my socks, but I'm trying to navigate my 2-year-old to put their socks on. And so we were when my kids were really young, it was a very loud, very spicy, very sensory overloaded family. I mean, we went from needing heavy things, I mean, kind of snuggling on the couch and having 17 blankets to, what we would call ADHD rage, where they're like ripping each other's hairs out, So it was a very wild and chaotic um, time when they were young. Yeah.
But you started to get some help. So
We did.
there was a little bit of a light, at least in identifying, what was going on and getting them some of the help that they needed. Did you find that you were able to do that?
Yeah. So I think because my oldest was early, she automatically matriculated early intervention, which led into, IEPs and special eds. We didn't really have to advocate too much for her. The system, the medical system kind of put her on that path. And then I had my next daughter. And so she, kind of had her own path externally. And then it was my son who was born in 2004, 2004. Um, and when he was 5, I mean, we knew by the time he was like 18 months old that there was something that was off, right?
Gotcha.
I recognized it immediately, and even then was sort of gaslit by his pediatrician who says, "Oh, he's just a boy. You don't know. You're the oldest of 4 girls. You have 2 daughters. Like boys are just wired different." And I was like, "Nope, something's wrong with him."
He's literally wired
Yes,
different.
yeah,
Thank you very much.
yes. And so when he was 5, um, we went through the special ed process through his kindergarten, and was working with Tufts Floating Hospital for Children, their center for children with special needs. And his behavioral pediatrician, we were doing a full neuropsych. So, I mean, remember, I've got 2 older kids. He's 5. So, I'm in my early 30s at this point. And they went through the whole evaluation process and looking across the table. And, his behavior pediatrician, who I love and just retired last year, put the papers down and looked straight at me, and she was like, "Okay, so who has ADHD, mom or dad?" I was like, "What are you talking about?"
Mhm.
Now his older 2 siblings had the same diagnosis, but no one had ever told me that it was genetic.
Wow.
And so she said, "There's studies coming out. This is highly, hereditary. Would you be willing to sit down with the evaluator and kind of go through this process yourself?"
Sure. Good to know. Thanks
And
for
I was like,
asking.
"Sure." And she held my evaluation up with my son's, and it was like,
Oh,
it
wow.
was literally a mirror, which was both enlightening on one hand, because you're like, "Oh, I'm not stupid. There's nothing actually wrong with me. There's just like, there's a reason. There's an explanation as to why things feel different for
Right.
me than like my best friend who's neurotypical."
Right.
And so that was the first enlightening piece. And then the second piece was the guilt that comes, I think, when you're a parent who is neurodivergent of neurodivergent children, and you recognize that it is something that is hereditary, and you realize, huh, I gave this. There's a parental guilt that comes along with that,
Hmm.
that requires a lot of mental health support, because if you're not dealing with processing that guilt and that trauma and feeling like you're trying to navigate that while also dealing with your son, you can go down sort of a mental health spiral.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you find some good support when you were going through all of that?
Great support.
Good.
We therapy and therapeutic intervention wasn't something that we weren't aware of. My mother had, albeit not the right kind of support. But so we were a family that wasn't like, we don't go to therapy. That wasn't us. We
Yeah.
were definitely like, who do we talk to next? And so we were very lucky that we did have, I and my kids all had the appropriate level of therapies, but it wasn't without a fight. I mean, it was because, again, systemically, you basically, the barriers to getting the support, sort of advocating for it, I mean, you had to essentially sell one of your kids or sell a kidney to get them to believe that your child needs this level of support.
Yeah.
But it was a worthy fight, and it was something that we, you know, was just became our daily life. So then when my youngest came along, she's 11 now. When she came along, I mean, it was like we just knew, like we just I mean, I can remember having her as a crawling toddler at this behavioral pediatrician's office who was still working with my son,
Gotcha.
9 and 10 years old. And sh- she'd be like, "Yeah, we'll see you soon for this one." I say, "Yes, you will."
Yes, we'll
So,
see you.
yeah,
Because they're all going to be
because
like
they're
that.
all extra spicy. Yeah.
I love that, at least in recent years, there has been a lot more awareness, especially, at that level,
Yeah.
the kids. And so there is a lot more education, there's a lot more diagnosis, there's a lot
Mhm.
more treatment going on. But, for you and for us as adults, that's a whole different story because
Yeah.
we already went through all of that and we don't grow out of it.
No.
We don't change necessarily unless there's other things that are happening in life. That doesn't necessarily go away.
No.
And so, from your perspective and a late diagnosis, Tell me about how that felt, and I know you're also dealing with your 4 kids and going through all that and being an amazing advocate for them. But for you, then thinking about as an adult and everybody else around you that supposedly was maybe supposed to grow out of, these challenges they had as kids and haven't.
Yep.
So now you're navigating sort of this shadow culture feeling,
Mhm.
that you were talking about. And then also trying to figure out how can you be an
Yeah.
advocate? How can we navigate this in the workforce? So tell me about how that.
Yeah. I mean, I spent 25 years in the built environment, whether it was through real estate, brokerage, facilities operations. We would build buildings, we would run them. And, there was this expectation. It's almost like a chip on my shoulder. Like, you can't get the education, you can't get the job, And so every time I would climb this ladder, build this new building, manage this facility, it was like, no, I can do it. But it came at such a tremendous cost because it was almost like you were two sides of the coin. So you drop your kids off from school, they go on their merry way, and you would go in, and I would actually work with teams and buildings and clients that would be so dysregulating for me. We'd actually design buildings where I was like, I can't, looks great on paper, looks great in this elevation, but I would never be able to sit in there because I would literally lose my mind. And so here I am advocating for clients. They know this design is great, knowing full well that I or my kids would never be able to sort of be in that environment. And I did that for, my gosh, 15, 18 years.
It's exhausting.
It was exhausting. I mean, in many respects, it definitely contributed to my first divorce. Between that pressure, raising, at that time, 3 neurodivergent kids, it was, my mental health suffered, because then I would come home and my whole world was therapy and doctor's appointments. And at that time, I had learned so much that I almost took, was doing a lot of what we would call pro bono self, sort of advocacy work
Sure.
for other friends and family who were going through a similar IEP process and maybe couldn't afford an advocate. So I was doing a lot of this work outside, and
The shadow work.
and people didn't know. And so, it got to a point, right around 2022, the pandemic had a huge piece of it.
Sure.
And I remember sitting in a client meeting. I was a workplace strategist. I was sitting in a client meeting. I was like, they can't build this. And I was essentially told by my employer at that time to essentially shut up. And the days of someone telling me to shut up, like, it kind of was like that sort of the phoenix, right? Rising from the fire. I said, I'm done. I can't do this. I can't do this anymore.
Yeah.
My kids were, kind of aging. They were going through the college process. They were getting their first jobs. And I was like, I don't want my kids working in a place like this.
Yeah.
And so I said, I can't continue to advocate to build spaces I know that are going to be detrimental to human beings. And so I
You're
just,
working against your own values, even.
100%.
That's
Yeah.
hard to do.
Yeah.
And yes, we all have to take care of our client and what the client's goals and
Yeah.
budgets and, what their program and all is. But unless we feel like we can help them and help them
Yeah.
see a different perspective, then we don't feel like we're doing our job right.
No. And I just said, I can't do this. So I sort of left the industry, and everyone was like, oh my gosh, you're doing work around neurodiversity as if it was some sort of novel thing. I was like, oh, you just
When
started
did you
this.
start
And I was
that?
like, really? Because this is literally in my DNA, and I've been doing this since I basically entered this world.
Yeah.
But I didn't talk to anybody about it because in the world, in the construction design industry, I was already an anomaly. The number of design and construction meetings where I was the only woman. I mean, I can remember distinctly building a brand new biotech headquarters, being, my youngest, again, 11. So I was like 6 months pregnant, very pregnant with her, and basically being overlooked at the design meeting,
Huh.
for my report out because, I was a pregnant woman in a sea full of men.
Because you're a pregnant brain. So surely that couldn't
I was
be.
like, so that was the world, right? And so I didn't tell anybody that I was already a minority. I didn't want to sort of highlight the fact that, oh, also my brain, like, that ballast is going to blow. Well, how do you know? Just I can hear
I
it.
can hear it.
And it looks fine. Nope, I'm telling you, I hear electricity. Like, you don't say that to people. They think you're crazy. And again, it goes back to, if I articulate what's happening, that sort of subconscious part of how I grew up, they're going to throw me in a mental institution.
Yeah.
Like that. So we didn't talk about it because I was terrified of sort of the retaliatory judgment.
Yeah. Well, and
Mhm.
I can see why. I mean, we've all been there,
Yeah.
and it is a big stigma. And I think so. What's happening now is not that it's new at all. I mean,
Mhm.
and I get that, and I'm sure that's frustrating for you. So when
Mhm.
did you start this? What,
Yeah.
when did this, begin?
When I took my first breath.
Yes, when I was born, and when I became an advocate, about a day after that,
Yeah.
as young as I could remember. But so what do you think was the big catalyst? Did going through the pandemic, I feel like in a lot of ways, in a lot of different ways, it really brought to light some of these things that
Oh
we've
yeah.
always been struggling with. Particularly in the workplace, how it's not working. Surprise, it hasn't been working for like 20 years. Also, big surprise, not
Hmm.
surprise. We've been hybrid working for 20 years.
Yep.
These things are just like neurodiversity. These are not new things. We are just finally having the conversations, finally,
Hmm.
after all of this time. And so what did happen? What made that flip, and I know, you're in a meeting, you just decided, when you're like, I can't do this anymore. So
Yeah.
what did you decide in that moment? And what was going to get, you to be able to be the advocate that you are now, and getting this education out there for the rest of us who are kind of
I
clueless still?
I would love to say that it was a structured, calculated, well planned, well funded idea. But I have ADHD, among other things, and so nothing is really well thought. And so it literally, like most things, with people who have ADHD, you just sort of, that looks interesting, and you just go do it. And so there was this moment where I couldn't carry the cognitive load. There was nothing else that could offload that stress that I was carrying.
Yeah.
And so I was like, can't do this anymore. And it was literally a light switch. It was like, I'm done. I can't do it anymore. I had no plan. I had no idea. And I was just like, I think early on, if we had talked, when I left sort of the corporate world, I would have said, oh, I'm just going to do workplace strategy. No one even knows what that means. I'm just going to do workplace strategy. And then if someone had said, no, 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 you're going to be out there and you're going to actually write and you're going to speak, and you're going to teach, and this is going to be your job that you've been doing, by the way, for 25 years.
Yeah.
You're going to do this like in a very public way. I would have said, nope, not a snowball's chance in all things. Like there's no way. And so it kind of, the decision to leave was mental fatigue, but the decision to embrace this actually didn't come to for like 6 months after.
Okay.
And it was really a lot of my friends and family who had kids that were transitioning from high school to college that were really struggling
Yeah.
with that transition. And there's a systemic problem with that transition point, both neurologically for students, but also systemically when they transition from high school to college.
Yeah.
So their kids were really struggling. And I started taking them on and kind of,
And that was specifically for the neurodivergent.
yeah.
Yeah.
And that just sort of, and then it just
I
sort
mean,
of
it's hard
became
enough
this
for
bigger
kids,
thing.
for any kid
Hmm.
to be transitioning,
Yeah.
from that to college. And, these transitions in life are tough.
Yeah.
But then you add in, some challenges of not being quote unquote normal.
Normal.
And what does that do?
Yeah. And so that's sort of how it kind of, it's kind of like a snowball going down a hill.
Okay.
Sort of getting it there was really hard. And then it just sort of spiraled. So there was like that one turning point. And the big turning point for me was not just that one meeting where I was like, I'm out.
Right.
It was, you know, being in the pandemic and going home. And this, I think, happened. I'm sure you've had conversations with lots of people. This is a very reoccurring conversation I have with people. The pandemic caused people to go home. And if you are neurodivergent and you need certain things in your environment,
Mhm.
when you are in a public space, you can't control that. You can't control the noise. You can't control the light, like that light. Oh my God. You can't control the light, right? You can't, there's things you can't do. That one's making me mental. Um, so there's certain things that like you just have to suck it up and take it, buttercup. I mean, this is the way that we're
Yeah.
wired. And
Yes.
so then we go home and it's like, wait a second, pants feel bad today. Like I'm not going to wear pants with a zipper. So I'm just going to put sweatpants on and no one knows. And wow, I can actually work really well
Yeah.
in PJ bottoms. Or, oh my gosh, I don't need to wear socks with lines today because they're making me crazy. Or I need a certain temperature. Or I need background noise. Or I don't want to smell Susie's fish in the microwave,
Yeah.
at lunch. So
And I can sit here in the dark, with a
yeah,
laptop, and
and
just
just
chill.
work. Yeah. And so you had this cohort of individuals who were already in the workplace, by the way.
Yeah.
We were just hiding.
Yes.
So it's not like we're emerging and was this greater trend, but we were already there. We just didn't tell you. And so they went home and they said, wait a second, I actually can control my environment. I'm more productive. I'm happier. I don't have as many mental health or as deep mental health anxiety challenges as I was experienced when I was going to the office 4 or 5 days a week in an
Sure.
environment that I could not function in. And so I think a lot of people who maybe were either questioning whether or not they were neurodivergent, or maybe even were as a kid and didn't recognize how much they were masking in the workplace, that veil was lifted. And
Yeah.
so they learned a lot about their needs. And guess what? It also, human beings need to belong to something. And so we were never designed to be on an island.
No.
And so whether you're coming back to a centralized location, I don't care where it is. It could be a coffee shop, it could be an office, it doesn't matter. When people are coming back to the table, they're saying, this doesn't work for me anymore.
Yeah.
And so you're seeing a lot more vocalization of these are my needs because I've now learned what they were. And that was, I would say, a gift to the neurodivergent community that the pandemic gave.
Yeah. I think that's I think that's exactly what has happened, and now that people are coming back and aside from being neurodivergent, there's a lot of other challenges that people are having too
Yeah.
coming back. They've got aging parents, they have
Mhm.
childcare they no longer have access to. I mean, there's so many challenges in coming back on this sort of mass, return and full time and all the things, we're not ever going to really, in my opinion, go back to that, era. And I wish, most people would catch up with that.
I know.
I think it's really going to depend on the company. One size misfits all.
Yeah.
It's going to depend on the company, the departments, the people.
Mhm.
It comes down to the individuals, and we need to make sure we're getting that cross section, of individuals that
Yeah.
are working to understand what they do need in the workplace. And I think COVID and the pandemic, I mean, those are not positive things in any way, but if we can look at maybe something that came out of that, it is a lot more of this awareness.
Yeah.
And is that when you started your consulting company then? That was
Yeah, it was 2022,
okay.
2023 when I actually officially said I'm out.
What were you doing right before you decided
So
you were
I
gonna go
was
out?
part of a workplace strategy team for another furniture manufacturer. Um, but at the time, that's what we were, we didn't do anything with furniture. We were just really centered around strategy, trauma informed design. So ironically, I was actually doing a lot of this work, trauma
Okay,
informed design,
good.
neuro inclusion, universal design. So we were talking about all of that sort of in that period with that team. That's what I was doing right before I left.
And for those that don't know, that's generally what workplace strategy is. It's talking about all of the different
Yeah.
aspects of the workplace and the strategy of the people in that place.
Yeah.
And so I love that you were talking about things that weren't typically topics on the table,
No.
back in the day or even before the pandemic or, just a few years ago.
Mhm.
I think that was a lot. Those are such, important topics for us to talk about now. So tell me a little bit about the framework. And I know you have a whole course on this,
Yeah.
and we'll make sure in the show notes people can get to your website and contact you too. But can you, just for the sake of having this conversation, give us a little bit about the basic framework?
Mhm.
Are there any, crazy terms that people are using out there that they shouldn't be, that they're using wrong, or if they're just kind of some basic, I'm coming to you, I am executive, I've never had these conversations with
Mhm.
my leadership team or any of my people before. What would you say to them? Like, can you give them a rough idea of like, here's some basic terminology you need to understand, and here's some questions you need to start asking?
So that's loaded. So most of the time when I'm approached by leadership, it's usually because something has happened internally that is triggering them to take action. And I
Okay.
commend them on that. And usually when they want to chat with me, they want an executable plan. They want to do something. They don't want to learn, and this is not a knock on them.
They need check
They
boxes.
want to check the boxes. They
Yes.
want to say, I have done X, Y, Z. I'm going to slap it on my website. I'm going to share it to my office. And I'm going to say, look, I've done all the things. I don't know what you're still complaining about. And so, I mean, if they have the unfortunate, you know, um, meeting with me, they quickly realize I'm not giving them a checklist because what they really need is that foundational literacy. And so it doesn't matter what your checkbox is. It doesn't matter what website or what book you go after. And it says, do these 17 things. If you do those in the absence of knowledge, you are going to detrimentally impact somebody.
Yes.
And so I always say we have to start with foundational literacy, and that is kind of the bedrock, the sort of foundation. And that foundational literacy is really looking at the terms that people are talking about. So some of the ones we were talking about earlier, neurodiversity, neurodivergent versus neurotypical. It's also talking about getting them to understand that cognitive diversity can be genetic or it can be acquired. And this is usually when we start giving examples, this is usually when they're like, huh. So you get that sort of cockeyed look.
I
Um,
did that to you, I think, too. Yes.
yeah.
Now I see that.
Yeah. So if we go back to the societal framework of the definition of neurotypical, meaning it's what society deems normal.
Normal,
Okay.
right.
I don't know who came up with that. I couldn't tell you
I'm not even
because
sure what it is.
I don't even know what that means.
Yeah.
But if you have an acquired or a genetic, some people will call it, or hereditary.
Sure.
Those are things like me and my kids. Okay. We were just born this way. Nothing happened to us. And then you can have an acquired neurodivergence, which could be PTSD, brain injury. So a traumatic brain, TBI. You
Hmm.
could have a stroke or something like that. Also menopause, which we've got a lot of women in our workplace that are of premenopausal and menopausal age.
Yeah.
That is an acquired cognitive difference. Because the number of times I and my menopausal and premenopausal peers have walked into a room and said, "Why am I in this room? I don't know why I'm here." Um, that is when your brain is functioning at a level that is not normal. Not only not normal for you, it's not normal for society.
Gotcha.
So you can have an acquired difference and divergence. So if you look at that spectrum and say, well, it can be genetic, inherited, or it can be acquired, that basically means every human in your office has some level of a need.
Yeah.
And so starting with that foundational framework of getting those terms out, getting them to understand that when someone says they're neurodivergent, it doesn't mean that they're autistic. It doesn't mean that they're ADHD. It doesn't mean that they're dyslexic, because there's an entire spectrum of neurotypes that fall under that umbrella, that divergent umbrella.
Yeah.
And so before we build a policy, before we build a program, before we put a stitch of furniture anywhere, you have to understand what the human body and brain needs and what those terms look like. And so that's that sort of that foundational framework that I start with.
Yeah. It's a good place to start. And then then there's a chasm below of
Yes. Yes.
all of the tasks that you would start with. So I think that that's really important. I want to stop there for just a second because it's the awareness, it's the foundation. And I think as long as you can get in, either your course or do some research or,
Mhm.
there's some basics to understand that, that is, like you said, that's the place to begin. And I think,
Yeah.
like you said, if you don't have that basic understanding, everything else that you do could actually be detrimental,
Yeah.
could be not helpful, first of all, but could actually be detrimental depending on what the needs are,
Yeah.
in the company.
Because you could
So,
create a incredibly inclusive physical environment, but if your policies and your programs are by default exclusionary,
yeah,
then it doesn't matter what sexy piece of furniture or what great technology you have. It doesn't matter because you're automatically excluding, your practices on the other side are exclusionary.
yeah,
And so I think that's where, if you can get people to stop trying to just execute on a task and say, please just stop, let's have a conversation around what does it mean to be autistic? What does it mean to have ADHD? What do learning differences look like? Oh, by the way, sensory integration dysfunction, sensory integration in all humans are more than your five senses. And so do you understand what that means? Do you understand when someone's having proprioception issues versus their vestibular system is dysregulated? None of this is what I'm saying. And so, and most people wouldn't. This is not daily vernacular for people.
yeah,
It is for me because this is the world I live in. But
yeah,
for the average person, especially in a leadership position, they don't walk into a conference room and say, how do I make this conference room work for somebody who's having proprioceptive challenges? I mean, this language doesn't
no, I don't
exist.
even know what that means. Can you tell me what those words mean?
So proprioception is essentially the ability for your nervous system, your brain and body to know where you are in space and time.
Okay.
When it is functioning optimally, you're walking around like a normal person. When it's not, so I have proprioceptive issues. I walk into things all the time. I walk into walls. I trip over my own feet. That depth perception
Okay.
is an issue. Sometimes I can feel, because I don't know where I am in space and time, I can crowd up against something, hug a wall. If I'm talking with someone, I might, that personal space that exists. Sometimes I can infringe upon that, which societally could be a problem if you don't like that personal, sort of
Close
closeness.
talkers.
But for me, I might not be able to register where I am
Got you.
and whether or not what I'm saying makes sense if I'm so far away. So, um, you know, that's proprioception. And then you have interoception, which is your internal body's ability to know what it needs. I'm thirsty, I'm hungry, I'm hot, I'm tired. It's sort of recognizing, I mean, when you're hungry, you get those internal cues like I should probably eat something. For somebody who's having sort of interoception issues, they may not recognize that, wow, these lights are making me mental, and so they're not going to recognize that that input is impacting their body in such a way that they are dysregulated. All they might see is the behavior on the outside,
Yeah.
meaning now I'm anxious, now I can't breathe, now my body is responding because I can't process that this is what is coming in. My visual cues are not registering
The
what I need.
awareness of it is
Yeah,
not there to be able to
yeah,
articulate what the problem is.
yeah. Then you have, your vestibular system manages your balance. And so for people who, and again, there's hyper, there's this spectrum in all of these, but your vestibular system allows you to be able to balance. And so if you're off, right, you're going to feel dizzy. You might not know where you are in space and time,
Yeah.
which impacts your proprioceptive sense. But this is why those, like I have one in my office, those sort of giant balls that you sit on.
Yes.
When I'm having a particularly challenging proprioceptive vestibular day, I don't sit in my chair. I sit on my bouncy ball because it allows my body to start to figure out kind of where I am in space and time.
Okay.
So these are just like, again, terms that people don't, it's not like we're learning that in an HR orientation.
No, we're not. I mean, and and we don't necessarily have to. And the same goes for design too, right? We talked a little bit before this about, how yes, and as a designer, I have a lot of awareness. I have a lot of research. I've been doing this for 30 years. My firm's been doing this for 20 years. We actually are pretty, like, I think we're pretty proud that we, design very human centric.
Mhm.
But when you start talking about all of that, I almost feel like, what have we been doing actually?
Mhm.
What is human centric? If you're talking about, all of these neurodivergent, challenges, and we have to learn how to take it to the next level. And I say that because, we talked about how, designers don't necessarily know that, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Architects and designers, we don't come out of school knowing this. We don't even come out of, certain specialties knowing this. And that's all right, but it's now is the time
Yeah.
for us to do the research, to bring in, the specialists, to bring in consultants like you to say, you know, are there things that we can improve, and what does that process look like if you're working with a company? I know it's going to vary, and it
Yeah.
definitely changes from, depending on the kind of team members you have, and it's
Yeah.
really going to kind of dial into some of that. But, what are some ways that you can start, having those conversations?
Oh,
Like you said, you can't just
yeah.
jump into design necessarily, but there's got to be some, amount of at least the questions to ask. Are there
Yeah.
surveys that go out? How do you start having that conversation
I
with
mean,
your employees, right?
I hate surveys. I hate surveys so
I do
much.
too.
They
I said that with a
just,
very,
like makes things and my neck stand up. I mean, everyone loves them, but I hate them because no one's ever really honest about them. And if you're a neurodivergent person who's been told no and that there's something wrong with you, or you grew up at a time when disclosing this means retaliation,
yeah.
you're not going to get actual answers. So when we're talking about these kinds of topics, I'm not sure that surveys are the best way. And people are still, because they don't know what the response is, or they're not seeing policies and programs or even physical environments
Yeah.
that are showing, that the company is at least thinking about these things, they're not going to give you the right answer.
Yeah.
So,
Well, that's what makes me so curious. How do you start those conversations? Because, like you said,
yeah,
they're either going to answer so that they sound more normal, or in a survey, or even in an interview. How do we let them know that we do care?
yeah.
So is that, if that's the issue, how do we let them know that it's okay to tell the truth, to be able to talk about these things in a constructive way?
I mean, that's the nirvana, right? You want to be able to
Yes.
have someone, if you're feeling like I need certain things in the environment, you want to be in a place where you feel comfortable to be able to share those things
Yeah.
and have them reciprocated and not retaliated against. But I think, there's always this question of like, who do we talk to? Do we get focus groups? Do we do surveys? And my question always to the leadership, and it doesn't matter what kind of project I'm working with them on, why does it matter? If you have a foundational understanding of the diversity in the diversity of needs in your workplace, and you want to be able to accommodate somebody who might be autistic, and you want to be able to accommodate somebody who might have sensory issues, or it doesn't matter. Why do you need to know from Sally or Susie or Joe that they have these things? Like, why do they need to disclose that to you?
Yeah.
If you have a foundational literacy, they don't have to disclose for you, because you're going to be building policies, programs, and places around those needs that you're aware of. And inevitably, what will happen as a result is those people who have those needs are going to be much more supported.
Mhm.
And then eventually they may feel compelled to share it. Maybe they don't, but it doesn't matter, because you're not necessarily need that data point to make those changes if you have foundational literacy.
Right.
So, I'll always say things like, I was working with a client, actually had nothing to do with the physical environment, ironically. And we were working with their HR team, and they were trying to reevaluate their interview process, their sort of onboarding, interviewing, hiring process.
Yeah.
It was extreme, and they thought, hands down, they were so inclusionary. And I just had them share what they were doing, not even recognizing that their simple process was excluding a large percentage of potentially viable candidates, because they were not taking into consideration the needs of, say, a divergent candidate, someone who might have autism, who might struggle with an in-person eyeball-to-eyeball interview, who might need additional context as it pertains to showing up here on this day. You're going to park in this location. You're going to come through this front door, which feels almost one of the feedback was, well, that feels rudimentary. Shouldn't they already know that? Okay, that's a societal expectation.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a bias that you're putting on your process. Why, if they've never been to your facility, if they've never driven to your location, would they have any idea where your front door is, what to do when they get there, where they should park, how long is it going to take them? Giving that context, you're going to go from this time to this time, and you're going to sit in this conference room where you're going to be sitting shoulder to shoulder, which tends to be a good, especially for an autistic person who struggles with eyeball to eyeball contact,
Okay.
a great alternative. And then we're going to go on a walking interview for this one. So you can get outside and see the grounds. And they had no idea that simply just giving an interview time, saying, TikTok, I hope you're there, and sitting in a conference room by themselves that was too hot, that had uncomfortable chairs, and wondering why their candidates weren't doing well. So, I mean, it's asking those questions, like, be willing and vulnerable as a leadership team to say, what are your biases, that your societally expected biases that have turned into unwritten rules in your organizations of how people are supposed to show up?
Yeah.
And be open enough to rip apart your expectations and say, always ask the lens, what are we doing from a policy, a place, or a program perspective that is inherently exclusionary? And that is the first question you need to ask, because it doesn't matter whether you're excluding someone who is autistic or ADHD. It doesn't matter what the neurotype is. If your process and your physical building is by the very nature designed to be exclusionary, you are going to have a negative impact on your people.
And with that foundational literacy that you talked about, you don't know that.
No.
But when you do have it, that allows you to think about some of those things. And I think that's a great point, because I think a lot of people, they go for, let's be inclusive. So they're
Yeah.
trying to figure out how to make it so inclusive without, like you said, thinking about what's making it exclusive, and that's not almost, that is more important,
Yeah.
right? To evaluate it from that standpoint, because you're not necessarily going to be inclusive to I'm sorry, you're not going to be inclusive to every single person
Right.
all the time, but eliminating a lot of these larger, exclusive policies and things that you said. I think
Even
that's,
meeting minutes.
yeah,
Like, how are you conducting your meetings? Do you have an agenda that goes out 24 hours with clear expectations? Are there
I
meeting
wish
minutes
we
that,
all had that.
right? Well, this is what I'm saying. Like, if you're not doing that,
Yes.
how does that process that you've just now, because of the way that your culture is assumed, is the unwritten rule and the expectations of the environment that you're in,
Yeah.
right? So okay, so don't give meeting minutes, but also don't be upset when you have employees that are not responding to that, that may end up struggling with your meeting etiquette.
Yes.
So I think that is really the question that I always push on people before we start going through like which chair and which this and which that is. What is the current state of your organization, and where are the exclusionary practices that have just by their very nature become the unwritten rules and expectations?
Yeah.
And that's a hard conversation for teams to have. And even design firms. I mean, it's on the design side, there's this expectation that clients have that their designer should be an expert in this.
Sure.
And I am diabolically opposed to that mentality. I don't think that they should be an expert. They never got that education. They never, I mean, I work with college students who are in design schools that are going to be matriculating into our next generation. Any class around human development, psychiatry, psychology, sociology, universal design, human design. I mean, these are electives. These are humanities electives that are not required,
Yeah.
and which is fine. They're still going through their design school, and they're still looking at, floor plates as a programmatic approach. Put it in an Excel sheet. How many people? How many square feet? Butts and seats, right? I mean, it's formulaic,
Ugh.
right? So they're not getting the context of humans in that formula. It's a
Yeah.
spreadsheet. And it's still, I mean, I just wrapped up my final semester at one of my colleges that I teach at, and I had 5 design students who were all doing space planning as part of their spring semester. And every single one of them was doing programming and space planning with an Excel. And I was like, do not show that to me. But they're teaching it in a formulaic way. And
Yeah.
so then they come to the workplace, and you've got clients that are saying, well, show me how to be inclusive. And they're like, well, that was a chapter in a book. I
Yeah.
have no idea what you're talking about. And so I just think it puts the design industry at a tremendous disadvantage and puts this incredible amount of pressure on that industry that doesn't need to be there, because it's not their fault
Yeah.
that they didn't learn that. It's not part of the traditional education.
It's not. And and it is frustrating. And for me, as somebody who, leans heavy, into understanding the people, and our firm lean heavy into understanding what's happening. And, we're the kind of firm that doesn't like the surveys and
Yeah.
I mean, I will do a spreadsheet, and I will do an executive,
Mhm.
summary, and I will do all of that. But I also will have copious notes
Yeah.
about the team that we met with in their space, and how
Mhm.
they work together, and how they work in the relationship they have with
Mhm.
their furniture and the people that are next to them, and understanding what their processes are, and they don't have lights on, and they're
Mhm.
making accommodations for themselves in the space already.
That
If you just
observation is
go, if you
huge.
just
Mhm.
go walk the floors, this is one of the things that we've done
Yeah.
so successfully. Even when we designed Sam's Club corporate headquarters, we met with thousands of people at Walmart and Sam's Club in their spaces, in their
Mhm.
cubes, in their work groups, because that is the only way to understand
Mhm.
how they're going to do, how they're going to be in their next space,
Yeah.
because they're already making those modifications. They're
Well,
already
this is
making it work for themselves.
And this
You
is
can
the thing,
learn
if you
from
can
them.
get somebody, if you can get a company or a client to say, look, we're going to do an observational assessment. We're going to
Yes.
put cameras up, and we're just going to observe. We're not going to share it externally with anybody, but we just want to observe how this team is navigating, like, say, this space.
Right.
So we're going to have cameras in here for a week, and we're just going to take data. We don't want you to do anything differently. And you're going to see how certain people show up. How are they adjusting their chairs? How are they leaving their desks at night, right? You're going to start to see the physical behavior of human needs manifested that you probably wouldn't get in an interview.
No, you're not, because they're not even thinking about
No.
it. We always find that's the biggest challenge. I know you don't like surveys either. Is well, what do you need? Well, I'm just going to pull from what I know. I need a file cabinet. I need this
Mhm.
and that, and we always laugh, because that's not at all what you need.
Mhm.
We need to know how you're going to get your job done. We'll help
Yes.
you figure out those tools
I need no
to
light over my
empower you.
head.
I don't need a light over my head. I actually don't need a file drawer, because that's just where I have my gym bag and my shoes and my
Yeah.
snacks, and And so the observation, I think, is critical. And I think it needs to be quick, it needs to be real, and we need to be able to pivot,
Yeah.
right? I think that there's a lot to be said for, testing and failing
Yeah.
and, going through even small areas, we always used to call pilot spaces,
Mhm.
to see what's actually happening. And like you said, the observation, you're either going to observe, live or,
Yep.
agree to put up some cameras for a little while and see what that means. And I think if leadership can really have those conversations with their people to say, this is why we're doing it, we want to make sure that that we're enabling you to do your best work,
Yeah.
then I think people will be a little bit more open, and not so, put off by the observation
Yeah.
or, they're going to get me in trouble or,
Yeah.
whatever
You're
the
going to see
employees are
them,
going to
searching LinkedIn in the middle of the day or whatever. But I think even something as simple as wayfinding,
Yeah.
right? So if you're talking to a designer, I mean, I was talking to one of my students about sort of what is wayfinding, what is the importance of wayfinding, and you start to hear the sort of expectations, shows you where to go, right? And yeah, it gives you all of the exact reasons of what wayfinding is. But then you ask them, why does that matter to a human being? And they pause because if they're a new designer, and I'm going to sort of segregate them out because those are the ones that I've been having the conversations with. No one's asked them that question.
Hmm.
Why do we have glass? Why would you want to have visibility around a corner? Why does that matter? And you start to push on them, and they will get the answer eventually because most of them are intuitive enough.
Sure.
They're probably also neurodivergent themselves. But you start to say, well, if you're an autistic person and you don't know where to go, what happens in the body? You start to shut down and you're not able to function. Your anxiety level goes up, your mental capacity goes down, your cognitive load is overloaded, and now you're done and you've got nothing. You can't do anything that day.
Right.
So if I don't know where I'm going, like I don't know what's around that corner. Do I constantly look over there? Am I supposed to go down that corridor? What's down that corridor?
It is a
Right?
very mysterious corridor.
It is a very mysterious
You want to go see what it is, don't
And
you?
there are lockers over there. But again, lockers, what are the lockers for?
Yeah.
I mean, am I supposed to put my stuff in there?
Did
Do I get
anybody
a
tell me how to
key?
use them?
How do I use these? Are they the punch code lock? Do I have a key? Well, now I got to remember where my key is, right? So these things that we're doing from a design perspective, it's not to say that we need to change how we're doing them. We just need to layer that foundational literacy around them
Yeah.
and continue to ask, like, okay, this is the right thing to do, but why would why would a human being need that?
Yeah.
And sort of pull that out of them.
And the conversation around it, the explanation of it too, right? I mean, I
Mhm.
think, and that goes for everyone,
Yeah.
and it's been kind of a pet peeve of ours too. You can build a great space, you can design everything, just right. There's all these features you can provide. But first of all, if the leadership is not showing it's okay to use the space
That's
the
right.
way that it's intended,
Mhm.
and number two, we're not explaining it. And I mean, we've seen some clients do a really great job of, actually having full color brochures on their new spaces.
Day in the life.
I can't even imagine how great that would be for somebody
Mhm.
who questions everything because
Mhm.
they have to and they want to know, what is this chair used for? What is
Yeah.
what is the function of it? What do I use that space over there for? Like you said, where do I go down the hall? Well, let me tell you the 5 different ways you can use that and make sure that your leadership is actually doing that and showing that it's okay.
Mhm.
And so I think a lot of this, aside from, the awareness of it and that education is the communication, right? I
Yeah.
mean, and if we're not communicating in the beginning, if we're not communicating when it's done,
Mhm.
we're not doing, our process justice,
Yeah.
right?
That sort of day two stuff.
Yes.
It's interesting because especially people who are late diagnosed, oftentimes they know what it feels like from a lack perspective, right?
Sure.
I know what it feels like when I don't have something.
Operating from scarcity.
Yeah.
Yes,
And then all of a
right.
sudden there's like this weird chair in the corner that's facing the window. And that looks really cool, but I don't know why would I want to go in that? Right? Because while they may have awareness and they may even now have a final diagnosis of what they're dealing with their whole lives, what they might not have yet is how to re-regulate or ask for certain things. They
Yeah.
may not know what they need. And so if you have an area or you have a specific thing, a policy or even a program that they can access and give them the context, like, here's why you might need this,
Okay. Yeah.
especially for someone who, is autistic. I have an autistic daughter, and this is why this is always so near and dear for me. Like, even a policy, here's why you might want to choose this particular 401k or, health insurance or dental plan over that one. And
Right.
here's how she needs to have every single solitary bit of context in giving her situational examples as to why a place, a policy, or a program might be right for her.
Yeah.
In the absence of that, she is dysregulated, she shuts down, she gets backed into a panic corner, and then operates at the 11th and a half hour out of fear because she has to get something done versus intelligence.
Yeah.
And so just those simple communication and thinking about it from a contextual perspective, why would you want to sit in this confined, closed, spinny chair? Why would you? Give some examples of what that would look like. That provides
Well, they need to have
individuals that
context for what
context.
those feelings are, right?
Right.
Like I might not even realize that a chair
Especially if
like
they have
that could be
interoception
a safe
issues.
space,
Yeah. If they have interoception or proprioception issues, if they don't know what they're feeling,
Yeah.
they just know that I can't function here. They may not have that connection between their brain and body. And so giving them that language and giving them that explanation, they're like, oh, I'm feeling this sort of way. I'm going to go sit in that chair for a
Yeah.
little while.
Oh, that's a great point. Or they might not want it because the light overhead.
That light, it's like
The light over
wild.
the chair that they're wanting to sit in.
Yep.
Thanks for joining us. And don't forget to like and share with a friend. And let us know what else and what other important topics you'd like to hear about.